Now, around the table with me, and I want to bring them in at this point, are Oliver Kamm, leader writer for The Times, and Stephen Hopgood, who's reader in international relations. Oliver, do you think the widening of the prospectus, even if what Claudio says is true, that the principles remain, the widening of the prospectus has been an unashamedly good thing?
I think it's been an unashamedly disastrous thing for Amnesty's moral standing and for the people it lobbies for. It was started in a small and quite heroic way, and I entirely agree with the point that it's been a vehicle for ordinary people to express their concerns on behalf of other ordinary people. But it started in a noble way as a defence of the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. It has widened to campaigns, some of which I think are entirely appropriate, like opposition to capital punishment in all circumstances and opposition to physical torture in all circumstances, but beyond that to issues that demonstrate a lack of moral seriousness. And I will give you two examples. The neutrality between democratic governments and jihadists who attempt to destroy civilian life in democratic countries, your association with an organisation called Cage Prisoners, which is a vehicle for Islamist protest, and your unconscionable treatment of an Amnesty worker, Geeta Sahgal, head of Amnesty's gender unit, whose cause I have taken up and the Times has taken up, whom you suspended for her protest against this.
I don't want to get lost in the interstices of Amnesty's own history, but if you can take the more general point on that Oliver's making, Claudio, without kind of getting lost in what I call the footnotes of Amnesty's history.
Well,
which is the neutrality, in effect. The neutrality ought not to be a neutrality.
We're not neutral when it comes to abusers. We're absolutely uncompromising in that respect. And whether it's abuses committed by democracies, a democracy abuse human rights in ways as well as dictatorships do. We are absolutely uncompromising on any movement, whether it's a government or a political movement that suppress women, that advocates violence against civilians, and so on. And that's, has always been very clear in that respect. So there's no neutrality there. The neutrality is that trying to, or the impartiality, which is a better term in this case, is to apply the same standards to whatever is the government, the political movement, and even members of civil society who are very able to abuse human rights just as the government is.
And what about the cage prisoners issue, just briefly?
Yeah, Cage Prisoner is an organization that does represent prisoners.
Islamists.
Of course, Islamists, they
of
have
course.
their own
So you
view.
admit it?
Yes, but the key thing
the
is...
discussion's over.
No, it's not over, because what you're implying that these people are advocating violence against civilian, discrimination, and so on.
Of course they are.
Well, that's where we have to disagree. If they were, these are
they've defended Abu Hamza, the leader of the mosque that sheltered Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. That's not freedom of expression in any sense that Amnesty as an organisation 50 years ago would have recognised.
Well, that's what the government tell us. Because we defend the right of somebody not to be tortured in prison, then we're defending their ideas.
That's
we work.
pitiful.
We even raise question about the way Osama bin Laden was killed. Does that mean that we're in favor of Osama bin Laden? That's a key distinction, but it's easy to confuse it, and there's been a lot of confusion in that sort of criticism that we've been receiving in this respect.
Stephen Hopgood?
Actually, I think I disagree with Oliver here, although I'm not going to particularly defend Amnesty's position. In fact, the old-style Amnesty would precisely have tried to maintain this position where it represented Islamists and it represented the Americans and their foreign policy interests. And it's precisely that kind of position which has become very difficult to sustain in the modern world.
And why do you think it's become difficult to sustain?
Because when Amnesty was founded, it was the only human rights organisation. This is still the sort of the end of the British Empire period. No human rights groups really internationally. Nobody producing this information. No global media. Now there are a vast array of human rights organisations, other media organisations, other political movements who have an interest one way or the other. It's kind of impossible to be heard above the noise, I think. It's very easy in the glare of the spotlight to make almost any position seem like it favours one political side or the other.
Do you think that's true, Claudio?
Well, I mean, it is more difficult today than perhaps a few years ago. There is a multitude of organization. We're one of many, and there are messages of all kinds being broadcasted and so on. But again, I go back to we are striving to maintain the same principles, and we know we work in environments that are very political, very ideological, where all kinds of information, disinformation, is being bandied about. It's part of the war. Of propaganda that governments and others wage. What we try to do is, again, to still maintain our impartiality, our accuracy, but also engage with the world. The world is messy, and in order to suggest some solutions and so on, you need to engage with reality. So sometimes we've been accused of being too pragmatic in a sense.
Okay, can we widen it out? Because we're using Amnesty both to kind of look at what it's doing, but also to think of the role of campaigning NGOs. One of the things that distinguishes this period from an earlier period is the role of what one might call non-state actors, who certainly wouldn't have been there in the earlier part. I mean, Stephen, do you think non-state actors have made campaigning NGOs, and not only Amnesty, made their job much more difficult? Because actually it's hard to know what to do with them. With states, NGOs have a relationship. With non-state actors, they don't.
Yes, of course, it's become extremely difficult. If you look in areas like international humanitarian law, war crimes, violence against women, often you're dealing with people you have no direct access to, or people who haven't signed up to any international standards or legal agreements. Many religious organisations have a great deal of legitimacy in local areas, and you're directly targeting them on things that are extremely well supported in the areas that they're operative in. So, and once you go down that route, it's almost impossible to bring yourself back. There's such a vast array of issues, political competition, different sorts of groups, that sticking closer to a set of more easily definable principles becomes an increasingly attractive option.
Do you think that's true, Oliver? Again, not now about Amnesty, but more general. Actually, clarity and simplicity may be, as it were, one way of navigating this kind of rough sea in which everybody now sails.
Yes, I agree. NGOs have an important, a vital role to play in the wider political scheme, because politics is about trying to reconcile competing values, conflicting claims to scarce resources. And it's very easy, precisely because that is the purpose of politics, to ignore simple legal or moral principles. The problem with Amnesty, which I will come back to, is that it has abandoned that simple moral message and treated with extraordinary intolerance its own people who've objected to it.
I think we've gone down that, and I don't want to keep going down that line. The issue here is this larger issue of the kind of role of NGOs. But this idea of competing principles, Claudio, how do you reconcile, as it were, competing principles? Let's take China, a complicated place. Here's a place that in economic terms has lifted maybe 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 25 years. And, its own rule of law is, to put it mildly, susceptible to change without notification in terms of its own citizens. How do you reconcile those two positions?
First, if I may, just one point about our engagement with non-state actors. I mean, some of them are not very different from governments. I've been involved in discussions with Hezbollah, with Hamas, the same ways we campaign on them when they attack civilians and the rest. So, in fact, in that sense, we've been applying our same standards to others who, kill in the same way as some governments kill, and so on. With regard to, I'm not sure what is there to reconcile in a sense, because people in China again want both economic progress, at the same time they want to be free to manifest their views and so on. And both things go together. I know there's a bit of a myth that in order to achieve growth and economic development, repression and is a cost to be paid. But actually,
no, but it isn't a cost to be paid. But in Indonesia and in China, other places, economic modernization and development has happened without the kind of liberalism that, as it were, Amnesty grew up with. That's just a historical fact, whether we like it or not.
Well, the point is, if you had liberalism, if you had the freedoms and so on, actually, you might have had even better economic progress than you have at the moment.
Stephen?
Yeah, the entry of China into a sort of superpower status is an extremely interesting development. Whether or not China will uphold those liberal secular norms, which we've pretty much taken for granted at the international level. Remember, the United States is an odd case here. The United States isn't a supporter of the International Criminal Court, took a long time to sign, and the Genocide Convention, isn't a supporter of the Children's Rights Convention. So it's always had a very ambiguous relationship with international human rights while being a domestic rights observer. So one possible option for the future is that as the United States looks to the Pacific, not Europe, what we're looking at really is the end of the European ideological dream to go along with the end of European political power after the Second World War.
And what are the consequences, you think, for NGOs in those circumstances? NGOs that are often European in their origins.
Well, I think the language of human rights doesn't travel very well. I don't think it travels very well outside that core Christian European heartland.
Do you think that's true, Oliver?
No, I don't. I think it travels perfectly well. I would slightly contradict your point about the United States. It's scepticism of signing up to transnational schemes for human rights or juridical organisations is mainly a reflection of its belief in state sovereignty. I regret that, but that's a long-standing cultural view. It didn't prevent the United States from urging the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia, among other countries, from signing up to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt. I think that human rights are indivisible. On that point, I entirely agree with the founding philosophy of Amnesty, even if not its later tergiversations, and universal. There is a long-standing conflict between the idea of economic development and whether it is served by political democracy or whether you can do it without political democracy. My feeling is quite hopeful that in the end China, by being a more developed economy, will become a more liberal society. But until it does, and if it does not, there is an essential role for NGOs in pressing that case.
What about, just to take those points, Claudio, and just to now cast you as what you are, which is a senior member of Amnesty, how does Amnesty, as it were, make travel its principles to parts of the world where that culture is not, as it were, part of its DNA? It's immensely difficult in China. After all, NGOs are ineffectively, there's very, very few NGOs allowed in China anyway, and most of them are actually GOs masquerading as NGOs.
I think, again, we like to challenge the assumption because, yes, it's true. You know, the government in China and elsewhere is all powerful, and you have quangos and so on. But at the same time, you have millions, hundreds of millions of people who have the same aspirations as everybody else. They may express them in a different way. They may not use the language, the technical language of, a convention.
But the question is, how does the NGO navigate that part of the world? Whatever, anybody who thinks they can speak for 1.3 billion people is an optimist. But let's just for them at the moment suspend that. The big issue is, how does the NGO navigate, negotiate with a place like China, with the Chinese authorities?
Well, again, by treating them like everyone else, confronting them with their own role, both domestic and in foreign policy, in terms of their abuses. But at the same time, we're developing links with Chinese society and other society. That it's true, there are some places on this earth that are still pretty much closed, but that's doesn't last long. There are ways of being in touch, and we want to exploit that. We are planning to get many more members in parts of the world that we haven't reached. Yes, today we're still pretty much a Western Northern organization, but we know there's huge potential elsewhere, and that's where we want to be.
I want to ask our two non-Amnesty people, what would be your one wish? I need this very briefly. Your one wish, Oliver, for Amnesty in the next 5 years?
Stop imagining that you can be a political movement outside politics. That will serve your credibility and your moral seriousness very well.